In the summer of 1955, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago traveled south to visit relatives in Mississippi. His name was Emmett Louis Till, and he would never return home alive. What happened to Emmett Till in the Mississippi Delta became one of the most significant catalysts for the American civil rights movement, a tragedy so profound that it awakened the conscience of a nation and helped ignite a struggle for justice that continues to resonate today. This is the story of a young life cut tragically short, of a mother's unbearable grief transformed into determination, and of how one boy's death became a turning point in American history. Emmett Till was born on July 25, 1941, in Chicago, Illinois, to Louis and Mamie Till. His early life was marked by both love and hardship. His father, a soldier during World War II, was executed by the Army in 1945 for willful misconduct. Mamie raised Emmett as a single mother, working long hours to provide for her only child. Despite these challenges, Emmett grew into a confident, outgoing teenager. His friends called him Bobo, and he was known for his sense of humor and his ability to make people laugh. He attended McCosh Elementary School and was described by those who knew him as responsible, funny, and full of life. He had contracted polio as a young child, which left him with a slight stutter, but this didn't diminish his vibrant personality. Emmett lived in a predominantly black neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, where despite the presence of segregation and discrimination in the North, life was markedly different from the Jim Crow South. He could attend integrated schools, use public facilities without restriction, and live without the constant, immediate threat of racial violence that defined daily existence for African Americans in the Deep South. In August 1955, Mamie agreed to let her son travel to Mississippi to visit relatives and spend time with his cousins. She had reservations about the trip. She knew the South was dangerous for black people, especially for a young boy who might not understand the unwritten rules that governed racial interaction in that place and time. Before Emmett left, she warned him about how to behave around white people in Mississippi, advising him to be humble, to always say, "Yes sir," and "Yes ma'am," and to be extremely careful. Emmett assured his mother he would be careful. On August 20, 1955, he boarded a train heading south, excited for his adventure. Neither he nor his mother could have imagined the horror that awaited him. Emmett arrived in Money, Mississippi, a small town in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. He stayed with his great-uncle, Moses Wright, a sharecropper who lived in a small cabin outside of town. Emmett spent his days playing with his cousins and other local children, picking cotton, and experiencing rural Southern life. On August 24, 1955, Emmett and a group of teenagers went to Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market, a small store owned by Roy and Carolyn Bryant. What exactly happened inside that store remains disputed to this day, though the consequences were devastatingly clear. According to some accounts, Emmett may have whistled at Carolyn Bryant, the white woman working behind the counter. Other witnesses said he said, "Bye, baby," as he left the store. Some versions suggest he showed her a photograph of a white girl and claimed she was his girlfriend. Years later, Carolyn Bryant herself would admit that key parts of her testimony about the encounter were false. Whatever actually transpired, the interaction violated the rigid racial codes of the Jim Crow South. For a black boy to show any perceived familiarity with a white woman was considered a grave offense, one that could result in violent retribution. Emmett's cousins who were with him that day immediately recognized the danger. They knew he had crossed an invisible but deadly line. In the early morning hours of August 28, 1955, just 4 days after the incident at the store, Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Millam arrived at Moses Wright's cabin. Armed with pistols and flashlights, they demanded to see the boy who'd done the talking. Despite Mamie Till's pleas to leave the boy alone, they forced Emmett from the house at gunpoint. Moses Wright, despite his fear, would later show tremendous courage by testifying against the 2 white men in court. At the trial, when asked if he could identify the men who took Emmett that night, the elderly sharecropper stood up in the courtroom, pointed directly at the defendants, and said, "There he is," identifying both Bryant and Millam. This act of bravery by a black man openly accusing white men in a Mississippi courtroom in 1955 was virtually unprecedented and extremely dangerous. But that August night, there was nothing Moses Wright could do to save his great-nephew. The two men drove Emmett away into the darkness. What happened to Emmett Till over the following hours was an act of unspeakable brutality. Bryant and Milam later admitted, after their acquittal, that they had taken Emmett to a barn where they beat him severely. They pistol-whipped him, gouged out one of his eyes, and shot him in the head. They then tied his body to a heavy cotton gin fan with barbed wire and threw him into the Tallahatchie River. The level of violence inflicted upon this 14-year-old child was extreme even by the horrific standards of racial violence in the Jim Crow South. The torture and murder lasted for hours. Emmett's killers wanted to make an example of him, to send a message about what happened to black people who stepped out of line. 3 days later, on August 31st, Emmett's mutilated body was discovered in the river. When Moses Wright was brought to identify the body, he could only recognize his nephew by a ring Emmett wore that had belonged to his father. When Mamie Till received the news that her son had been murdered, her world collapsed. The child she had raised alone, her only son, had been tortured and killed in the most brutal way imaginable. The authorities in Mississippi wanted to bury Emmett's body quickly in Mississippi, but Mamie insisted that her son be returned to Chicago. What Mamie Till did next was an act of extraordinary courage that would change the course of history. When Emmett's body arrived in Chicago, she made the decision to hold an open-casket funeral. She wanted the world to see what had been done to her child. "Let the people see what they did to my boy," she said. Emmett's body was displayed in a glass-topped casket. His face was severely disfigured, swollen beyond recognition, with one eye gouged out. The images of his mutilated body, published in Jet magazine and other black publications, shocked the nation. Thousands of people filed past Emmett's casket to pay their respects and bear witness to the brutality of racial hatred. The photographs were graphic and disturbing, but they served a crucial purpose. They forced people across America, particularly those in the North who might have been unaware of or indifferent to the violence faced by black Americans in the South, to confront the reality of racial terror. They could no longer look away or pretend not to know. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam were arrested and charged with murder. The trial took place in September 1955 in Sumner, Mississippi, the county seat of Tallahatchie County. The courthouse was packed with spectators, with black attendees forced to sit in a segregated section. Moses Wright's testimony was powerful and dangerous. For a black man to accuse white men in a Mississippi courtroom took immense courage. His testimony was corroborated by other witnesses who testified about seeing Emmett in the back of a truck the morning he was taken. Despite this testimony, and despite the clear evidence of murder, the all-white, all-male jury deliberated for just over an hour before returning a verdict of not guilty. One juror later said they would have deliberated even faster if they hadn't stopped to drink soda. The acquittal shocked many Americans, particularly in the North, though it surprised few people familiar with the Southern justice system. Black people had been lynched and murdered throughout the South for decades, and their killers almost never faced consequences. The Till case, however, received unprecedented national and international attention, making the miscarriage of justice impossible to ignore. Protected by the legal principle of double jeopardy, which prevents someone from being tried twice for the same crime, Bryant and Milam gave a detailed confession to journalist William Bradford Huey several months after their acquittal. In a Look magazine article published in January 1956, for which they were paid $4,000, they described in graphic detail how they had murdered Emmett Till. They showed no remorse. In fact, they seemed to believe they had done the right thing, that they were protecting their way of life and defending white supremacy. Their confession confirmed what everyone already knew but couldn't prove in court: they had tortured and murdered a 14-year-old boy. Bryant and Milam lived the rest of their lives in Mississippi and the surrounding area. They faced some social ostracism and economic consequences, with many people refusing to do business with them, but they never faced legal punishment for their crime. J.W. Milam died in 1980, and Roy Bryant died in 1994. Both died as free men. While Emmett Till's murder was a tragedy, its impact on the American civil rights movement cannot be overstated. The brutal killing of this young boy, the courage of his mother in exposing that brutality to the world, and the miscarriage of justice that followed galvanized a generation of activists. Many leaders of the civil rights movement pointed to Emmett Till's murder as a pivotal moment in their political awakening. Rosa Parks, who would refuse to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus just 3 months after Emmett's death, said she thought about Emmett Till when she made her historic stand. The Reverend Jesse Jackson called Till's murder one of the most significant acts that triggered the modern civil rights movement. The case demonstrated that the struggle for civil rights couldn't wait any longer. It showed that the violence and injustice faced by Black Americans in the South demanded immediate action and national attention. Young people across America, both black and white, were moved to join the growing movement for racial equality. Mamie Till, who later became Mamie Till-Mobley after remarrying, spent the rest of her life fighting for justice and civil rights. She became a teacher and an activist, speaking around the country about her son and about the need for racial justice. She transformed her unspeakable grief into a lifelong commitment to education and activism. She often said that Emmett's death was not in vain because it helped spark the movement that would eventually dismantle legal segregation in America. While no amount of social progress could ease the pain of losing her child in such a horrific way, she found purpose in ensuring that people never forgot what happened to Emmett and why it mattered. Mamie Till-Mobley died in 2003 at the age of 81. She never lived to see full justice for her son, but she lived to see the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and tremendous progress in racial equality, progress that her son's death had helped make possible. For decades, the Emmett Till case remained closed from a legal standpoint. However, in 2004, the United States Department of Justice announced it was reopening the investigation. This was prompted by documentary filmmaker Keith Beacham, who uncovered evidence suggesting that more than a dozen people may have been involved in Till's abduction and murder. The investigation was formally closed in 2007 after the FBI concluded that it could not pursue further charges. By that time, the main perpetrators were dead, and others who may have been involved either could not be conclusively identified or were protected by statutes of limitations. In 2017, author Timothy Tyson published a book revealing that Carolyn Bryant had admitted to him in a 2008 interview that parts of her testimony about Emmett Till were false. This revelation led to calls to reopen the case yet again. In 2018, the Justice Department reopened its investigation based on this new information. However, in 2021, the Justice Department closed the investigation for what officials said would be the final time. A grand jury in Mississippi declined to indict Carolyn Bryant Donham, who died in 2023, on charges of kidnapping and manslaughter. To this day, no one has ever been held legally accountable for the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett Till would have turned 84 years old in 2025. We cannot know what kind of man he would have become, what contributions he might have made, what joys he might have experienced. All of that was stolen from him on that August night in Mississippi when hatred and racism took the form of two men with guns and a determination to commit murder. What we do know is that Emmett Till's death mattered profoundly. His story reminds us of the terrible cost of racism and hatred. It reminds us of the courage of people like Mamie Till-Mobley and Moses Wright, who refused to let injustice go unchallenged even when doing so was dangerous. It reminds us that progress toward justice, while real, has always been hard-won and incomplete. Today, memorials honor Emmett Till's memory. The Emmett Till Memory Project has installed historical markers at significant sites related to his story, though these markers have repeatedly been vandalized, a sobering reminder that the hatred that killed Emmett Till has not been fully extinguished from American society. In 2022, President Joe Biden signed into law the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, making lynching a federal hate crime. While this came far too late for Emmett and the thousands of other victims of racial terror, it represented a formal acknowledgement of a dark chapter in American history and a commitment to preventing such horrors in the future. The story of Emmett Till is painful to tell and painful to hear. But it must be told. We must remember this young boy who traveled south one summer and never came home. We must remember his mother's grief and her strength. We must remember that justice delayed is justice denied, and that the fight for equality and human dignity continues. Emmett Till's life was cut short by hatred, but his legacy lives on in the continuing struggle for a more just and equal society. As long as we remember his story, as long as we commit ourselves to fighting injustice wherever we find it, Emmett Till's death, while tragic and senseless, will continue to call us toward a better future.